The single greatest challenge I have with teaching online or holding online meetings is the lack of feedback. If we're doing an in-person class, I ask for and I receive a tremendous amount of feedback. I stop at almost every paragraph and I check. I say, does this make sense? Are you still with me? Is any of this confusing? And regardless of what they say, I can see on their faces if they're confused. But when you're training online or meeting online, your audience consists of these little postage stamp-sized images. So checking in with them means you can't just assume that they are following. You have to ask. And if there's one great truth about teaching online, it is this. You must be comfortable with silence. You must be comfortable with silence for a very long time. If you ask a question of the group, it will often take them a very long time for them to respond, and our goal is to simply wait it out until somebody somewhere gives you feedback, no matter how long that takes. Feedback is critical to learning. A story I heard goes like this. The space shuttle, they said, was off course 84% of the time, but every few seconds it would send a ping down to Earth, and the Earth would send a ping back to the shuttle, and the shuttle would adjust its course. That's what we need to do with our team. We need to send a ping out and get a ping back, and then adjust. And that process has to be repeated all the way through our training. The best practice is usually to send a pre-training questionnaire. Solicit from your group how much they already know and what their weak areas are. Send your ping out, get it back, and adjust. I am always surprised from this pre-training questionnaire. We just did one where the CEO told us ahead of time, listen, everybody already knows this stuff. The questionnaire went out and came back, and it was clear that there was a significant gaps between what the CEO thought they knew and what they actually knew. We also follow up with a very similar post-training questionnaire to see how much they learned and if they have any remaining gaps. Those two tools, the pre-training questionnaire and the post-training questionnaire, are invaluable to get the right read on your team. Once we begin training, I insist that everyone have their audio and video working. I want it to be very like in person if we can. If in person we expect everyone to participate, then when we do online, we expect that as well. The default position is audio and video being on. Then I get the group warmed up. I'll usually start by having some kind of a multiple choice goofy quiz. I'll put up a choice like this. Well, how's your week been so far? Terrible? Awful? The worst ever? You'd never believe me if I told you? Or forget about it. And I say, shout out your answers. And the louder the better. And before long, 20 people are shouting out, forget about it, as loud as they can. That's a nice icebreaker. And importantly, it gets them participating from the start. Now, I understand not everyone will want to be vocal, but I need that feedback to know where they are. Often I'll have a few of Confederates in the group, that is, maybe 3 or 4 friends that I can ask ahead of time to text me or go on chat and let me know if they're understanding. The last training I did had 4 people from Nashville, 1 in Missouri, and another 10 or so in Florida. And I had 3 Confederates set up ahead of time. The leader in Missouri was fantastic because she loved that, being a feedback friend, and she just kept a running chat with me the whole time. Got it, makes sense, and then all of a sudden she said, wait, what did that mean? And I paused and I went back, and if she hadn't sent that message, I would not have known that I had missed something important, and many of those people would not have gotten the message that they needed to get. What we're trying to achieve is a continuous call and response. My friend Margaret is the master at this. She literally builds her presentation as a series of questions. So a standard presentation might look like this. Point number 1, healthcare is rapidly changing. Number 2, the only way to keep up is continuous professional development. And number 3, that means the quality of that professional development is key to our success. See, that's a series of statements, but Margaret changes that immediately to questions instead. And she'll say something like, hey, we all know that healthcare is changing, right? Stephen, you've been in healthcare since the 80s. Have you seen some change? Of course you have. And so do we. We do a ton of professional development. Raise your hand if you've already gotten some CME credits, right? About half of us, about half the people on this today said they'd already gotten credits this early in the year. So here's what I want us to talk about today. And I'm glad that Karen was with us because you almost certainly know a great deal about this. What I want to discuss is if professional development is that important, then how important is it for us to get high quality training? See, it's the same content, but instead of a series of statements, it's a series of questions, and she specifically calls out a few people in her audience. Questions really deserve a special mention in any online training space. Questions engage. We are built where if we're asked a question, we have to find the answer. There's an allure of the jigsaw puzzle or the crossword puzzle. We lean into questions and we lean away from statements. The message I want to leave with you is this. If we want to assure that your audience feels involved and is listening, ask questions. They may be rhetorical questions. They may be questions that you expect an answer, but ask questions. Questions have power. Next point I want to make is make it about them. If you want to capture and keep your audience's attention, make the speech about them. That's easy enough, right? Dr. Norman Vincent Peale said 80 years ago that everyone's favorite word is their own name. People are naturally focused on themselves and their needs, so when a speaker addresses those needs, we pay attention. So the first question is, what are the people in front of you online? What are they worried about? What are their concerns? What's going on in their lives? I'll give you an example. Our small town of Pensacola, Florida, was rocked with an apparent act of terrorism recently. It took a long time, but when elected officials first began to speak about it on the news, the first gentleman stood up to the mic and he said this: I know we're hurting. I know we are afraid. I know this violence is something that we never thought would happen here. And today it did. We can't make sense of it. We're angry about it and we don't know how to put that anger away. See, he was speaking exactly what our thoughts were, and that's very powerful. Probably the best speaker I've ever known is a man named Quint Studer. Quint became famous by healthcare organizations helping them improve customer service. Now, that's what he does, but how he does it is he does it by captivating thousands and thousands of healthcare leaders with his public speaking skills. He has a way of feeling exactly where the audience is and addressing them right there. Some years ago, I watched him at a two-day conference. All morning, Quint was lively and bouncing around and making doing funny voices and telling jokes, and the audience was right with them every step. Then they went to lunch, and when they returned from lunch, all the energy drained out of the room. The room was too warm, they probably ate too much for lunch, and everyone seemed more ready for a nap than they were to spend the rest of the day listening to a speaker. Now, I expected Quint to come out there and be larger than life, to be big, to be funny, to bring back the energy. But he didn't. Instead, he began by speaking quietly, barely above a whisper. He stood still for a long time. He wasn't funny or active or dynamic at all. What's going on? Where was the Quint from the morning session? Well, it turns out that Quint understood this dynamic about speaking. You have to go where your audience is. His audience was sleepy, and he had to pace alongside them. Imagine if you're a jogger and you run up next to somebody, you can blast past them twice their speed, and it's not going to make any difference. But instead, if you pace alongside them, humans naturally sync up. In just a few yards, you get in sync with your audience. And then slowly you begin to lead them one step at a time, just run a little bit faster and a little bit faster. Well, that's what Quint did. After a prolonged period of being quiet and somewhat somber, he picked up the pace a little bit. And then the audience followed him there, and then he moved to pace a little bit more. Salespeople call this technique the pace and lead. Start where your audience is and gently move them to where you want them to be. The next point I want to make is make it relevant to their lives. We were not surprised to find this question, is this information relevant to our lives, was very important. Because after all, if you tell a hungry man where to get a meal or a thirsty man a place to get a drink, they're bound to listen to that information. When we asked if the presentation seems relevant to your life, the difference between the most successful and the least successful presenters was 21%. People have hunger for information that can help them understand the world and their place in it. Our audiences are looking at us for answers, for wisdom, for inspiration. And the successful presenters are the ones who are able to make direct connections between the message and the audience's concern. And it's been my experience that we need to make those connections for our audience. It may seem totally apparent how this story connects to this need, but your audience, far too often, they like the story, but they fail to see how it connects with their concerns. Quite often, we need to step back and say, now here's why I told you this story, and then make the connection for them. Next point I want to make is make it conversational. Gone are the days of lofty rhetoric. The great orators like George Washington wouldn't be well received today. Imagine, this is a George Washington quote. All I dare hope is that if, in executing this task, I have been too much swayed by a grateful remembrance of former instances, or by an affectionate sensibility in this transcendent proof of confidence of my fellow citizens. Speeches were at one time they were grand affairs, and people would travel from far away to witness Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln speak. Newspapers reported the entire length of their speech, and it was often carried verbatim in the newspaper. Any public event would be expected to be accompanied by at least a few patriotic speeches, and rhetoric was taught from a very early age. But just as our manner of dressing has become more informal, so has the style of public speaking. TED Talks, which have come to represent the gold standard of speaking in our times, are decidedly informal, to the point that early TED Talk speakers were specifically told to not wear a tie. And most public presentations today feel more like a conversation between friends than a formal event. When we asked in our survey, did the speaker sound conversational? The top speakers were 18% more likely to say yes than the struggling speakers. This reality is the informality of speech is bled into every piece of our public lives, and our audiences expect it for us. I understand online training will always be a little harder than in-person training, but we can be successful at it if we'll put in a real feedback system in place and insist that the groups participate. Expect this process to take some time. Most people think, oh, an online course, this is going to be passive. But if your expectation is that you'll require participation, they'll get used to that and they'll be ready. Good luck, and let me know how it goes.